Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Flourish FM, a podcast for the good life. Our guest today is Sonya Looney. Sonya is a world champion mountain biker with nearly 2 decades of elite racing experience across more than 25 countries, earning titles including 2015 world champion and 4 times USA national champion. Her unique background combines endurance sports with a deep expertise in positive psychology. She holds a master's in applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and another master's in electrical engineering with a focus on neuroscience. Driven by her passion for personal growth and well-being, Sonya focuses on helping high performers navigate perfectionism and balanced striving while cultivating vitality, purpose, and resilience. She's known for her infectious energy and relentless curiosity, and she's a national board certified health and wellness coach. Through her work as a TEDx speaker, podcast host, consultant, writer, and professional speaker, Sonya brings her knowledge and experiences to life. She's the host of the Grow the Good podcast, through which she inspires listeners by diving into topics like grit, mindset, self-worth, purpose, success, and healthy striving. Nick, what did you love most about our conversation with Sonya?
I think the first time in a while, maybe ever, we've had, granted, she's a researcher and a serious researcher, but she's also an actual athlete. So I like the way she was able to talk about the practical application and the reality. She didn't just live up in the clouds and in theory. And so for her to be able to come in with a master's in applied positive psychology, but not be exclusively focused on the positive, and to talk about well-being in a way that I think is appropriately nuanced and brings up richness and the role of unpleasantness and accomplishment, while still keeping well-being as the center focus, is always something I like to hear. But some of her more kind of what you might call original research around goals and goal framing and sort of the different outcomes or associations was really helpful as well. So I think anyone that's interested in kind of the intersection of well-being and performance will pull out more than a few things from what Sonya had to share.
Absolutely. Thank you. So this is Resilience, Performance, and Growing the Good with Sonya Looney. We hope you enjoy it. Sonya, welcome. How are you doing?
I am so stoked to be here as an avid listener of your podcast.
Wow. Well, we're stoked to have you as a guest. Thank you so much for joining us today. Someone with multiple incredible talents, and we want to dig into your life in these various careers you still have today. So you're a world champion mountain bike rider turned positive psychology researcher with a wealth of practical experience and academic expertise on the intersection between high performance and well-being. And we're going to dig into all this today. So can we start by you telling us about your background and what led to you doing the things you're doing today?
Honestly, I've thought about this question a lot, and curiosity and exploration are the things that have driven me to do everything in my life. So I didn't grow up riding bikes. I was a nerd. I was in band, all the things. And someone invited me to go mountain biking, and I thought that sounded like fun, and I was interested. So I did it. And then someone told me I should do a race. So I started racing, and I went all in. And I wanted to explore the world and explore myself. And bike racing was such a great vehicle to do that. And all these other things happened along the way that I never could have anticipated. So I always think about the choices that we make and the pivot points in our life, and how saying yes to something that seems like maybe even silly, how that can change the entire course of your life. And of course, I discovered positive psychology through this process, because as I got better in my sport, people started asking me questions. And at first it was, how do you train? Or, what tire pressure are you running? To how the heck are you doing the hardest mountain bike races in the world? And whenever I see you, you seem like you're smiling, or you seem to be able to get through these things. What is it that you're doing? And I didn't really know how to describe what I was doing. I just knew how to describe what came naturally to me. But then whenever I discovered there was a scientific field called positive psychology about 10 years ago, I thought, well, this is really great, because now I can give people tools that are evidence-based to help them do it too.
Wow, what an interesting journey. And within your studies in positive psychology, you take an interdisciplinary approach, right, on the relationship between high performance and well-being. And in particular, you're particularly interested in the problem that many people sacrifice their well-being in the quest to improve their performance. So which disciplines do you draw upon in this interdisciplinary approach? And what led you to that particular issue that people sacrifice well-being to improve performance?
Yeah, it started off more from a performance psychology lens, like working with a sports psychologist and trying to figure out how to get the most out of myself. but you can be performing at the highest level, doing all of the right things, but you may not necessarily be thriving in your own life. So that means that whenever you are very focused on a goal, you start giving up the things that are aligned with all of these different models of well-being. Like, what's the first thing to go whenever we get busy? We stop spending time with our friends. We stop taking care of our health, and our life becomes very one-dimensional. And of course, research is me search. And I've done that. I've given up all of these things. And we think that if I can just achieve this thing, then I will finally feel like I matter, or I'll finally be good enough, or I'll finally feel a certain way. When really the way that you want to feel is right in front of you. It just means that you have to pause for a moment and change the perspective and change the way that you do it. But we live in a culture that doesn't necessarily glorify that. If you see people working potentially less hours or spending more time with their friends or doing less in terms of working towards their goals, people might think, well, they're not as dedicated, or maybe they're not a high performer. But really, it requires having some sort of, I hate the word balance, but some intentional imbalance as you are working towards big things in your life.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because I heard well-being, right? I heard balance and imbalance. And so maybe we can tease it out this way a little bit. I'm curious how you think about well-being, or how you're using it here. And maybe you're going to go Mapster on me and kind of stick to that. But I'm curious, right? Because, and we can get into this a little bit, state versus trait, right? And are we generally well versus are we well in the moment? And we can nerd out on those nuances a little bit. But let's start with how you're using it.
I'm using it more in terms of the big picture, because I think that's why I mean intentional imbalance. There's times in our lives when we are working towards something where maybe we are not able to prioritize the things that make us happy, well, whatever the word you want to use in the moment. I like to think in terms of like a meaningful life and then a psychologically rich life. How are the things that you're doing aligning with those? Because a lot of things that I do don't feel good in the moment. They feel something else. It's not this like happy feeling. It's more of a feeling of interest, or like I'm working hard towards something that means something to me and I'm learning a lot. Whereas I think that whenever people think about well-being, they think, well, I just feel good. I feel happy. I'm not stressed. And that's not how I define well-being.
Yeah, good. I didn't think it was, but I wanted to kind of tease that out, because I think it's a really important distinction that you make, or at least that I've been able to tell that you make. This distinction between like pleasantness and unpleasantness, right? And so, okay, well-being and performance go hand in hand, but well-being kind of in your terms, and I think John and I would agree, we're talking about psychological richness. We're not talking about exclusive pleasantness.
No,
right?
We're talking more like eudaimonia and like psychological richness, novelty, interest, and perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, great. My dissertation was on eudaimonia, as I'm sure listeners have heard me say too many times. But
I need to read this now.
No, you do not. I promise. No, you do not.
Awesome. Were there any particular problems that really struck you about sacrifices people were making in their well-being to improve their performance? I take it this was a problem that struck you as a professional mountain bike rider, and that's what led you working this, right? So which areas was it? Was it like sleep, time with family, time with friends, nutrition?
That's a great question. So it's two things. For me, it was relationships with others and relationships with myself. Because a lot of times when we are striving towards performance goals, we can develop a performance-based narrative identity or a performance-based identity. Like Ben Walker's done some work on a theory of a performance-based identity, where your self-knowledge and personal meaning, all the things are hinged upon this, how you view yourself as a performer. So what happens whenever you don't do well, or what happens whenever you upgrade? Like when I upgraded in mountain biking, you start off and you earn points so that you can upgrade through categories. And my first year as a pro, like I wasn't very good. I was finishing near the back, and I had never quote unquote failed like that before. So I would be so upset. I'd be embarrassed. I'd like cry in my races. I dream of stabbing a hole in my tire, because I thought that my worth was only based on how good I was as a performer. And that was baked in really young. Like that was baked in before I even became a mountain biker. So I think that is something that people need to think about. And then the second part of the question is relationship with others. Whenever you're working towards something, when you're an athlete, it's 24/7. It's not like you work 10 or 12 hours or even 15 hours and go home. Every single decision you make goes towards what your next training is going to look like or what your racing is going to look like. And what that means is you have to give up sometimes a lot. Like sometimes you don't go to a wedding. Sometimes you don't go out to dinner with your friends because you need to go to bed early. And you have to make decisions that support the performance goals and not necessarily your, I'll use the word well-being goals here, your relational goals. And it's easy to forget that. And I remember when I read, there's a book, old book called The Happiness Advantage by Sean Achor. And he talks about how, and again, we can nerd out on what happiness is, but like he talks about how happiness is a precursor to success. And there was a study that he quoted. It was something like how students were studying for their exams, these Harvard students. And they looked at both groups of students, and the students that spent time with their friends and didn't like feverishly study every single second for the exam, they did better on the exams than the students who spent every single second preparing for the exam. So that's an example of how it's important where we need to be focused on the outcomes and on the process, but we also need to have a little bit of flexibility because there are other things at stake here whenever we are working towards something.
Great. There's a lot of different connections here and threads, which is, I can already see kind of basically the lit review, probably for papers you're thinking about or already writing. But you referenced this earlier, this kind of like delayed gratification or this delayed happiness, this I'll be happy when. Shout out to another Sonia Lear-Bormirski, who we need to get on here, John. And this idea that like, I'll be happy when I accomplish the goal. Right. And so a lot of the work we want to get into with you that you spend a lot of your time on is this sort of, it sounds like framing of goals, like mindsets around certain types of goals, which I think is super interesting. So one of those types, as you've already brought up, are these outcome focused goals. Not only are these problematic for performance itself, but you're also bringing up that when we become too outcome focused, we attach too much of our identity to it. They're problematic, not just for performance, but for well-being, which kind of compounds the problem.
Yeah. And, achievement goals are not only based on performance, they're also based on mastery goals.
Sure.
And the problem is that
explain mastery for us? That's important.
Yeah, it's basically like honing in on your craft. The goal is to learn and get better, not necessarily to have a defined outcome, but to always be moving forward. And you can, there's a bunch of research on mastery, like deliberate practice, doing it under a mentorship, having specific types of feedback. But even that can feel unsatisfying because as athletes over time, you actually start performing worse whenever you get older. Or maybe this has happened for me is you hit a plateau. Like if you've been doing something for 20 years, getting 1% better takes a lot of effort if you can even get 1% better. So if growth and mastery are always the goal, paying attention to what you're trying to master so that you can have different things in mind. So like in mountain biking, if I said, I just need to get faster, I'm probably not going to get much faster. But if I can maybe increase my technical ability or I can increase, for me, I think the reason why as a 41-year-old, I'm still able to perform at a really high level is my mind. And it's about racecraft. So what is it that you are striving for? And I think that it's even more than just like in my research I did, I said that, well, I did a research study with perfectionists because mastery is not going to be good enough. No outcome is ever going to be good enough. So what is good enough? What makes you feel like your goals are meaningful, like you have some sense of accomplishment? And I think it's important that we take a multi-dimensional view of how we're striving for our goals and how we define success.
Right. Awesome. Thank you. So that brings us to two key areas of your work we really want to talk about: perfectionism, or rather overcoming perfectionism, and kind of the main thing you're working on, as I understand it, meaningful work. Right. So let's go into the latter first. This is a major area of your research interest, and you're currently developing a research model of meaningful accomplishment, right? Which you started during your what Nick referred to as your MAP earlier, your Master's in Positive Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. So can you please tell us about this research model and what exactly is meaningful accomplishment? What does it mean to accomplish something meaningfully?
Well, I'm going to flip it on you and ask you about something that you've accomplished that was meaningful to you, and I'd love to hear from both of you about it, and then we can thread in the things that I'm working on.
All right, simple, straightforward example: launching and co-launching and co-maintaining this podcast for as long as we have done. That's meaningful.
And why is that meaningful?
Because I really enjoy it. I learn a great deal from it. It's great fun. And I do feel that we are it's been a little way helping people to live better lives by them listening to our podcast and applying some of the ideas that our great guests, such as yourself, to talk about. And that's not just from assumption, that's based on what people tell us, and email us and tell us in person and so on.
So interests, learning, and helping others.
And fun. It's great to co-host it with Nick.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. That's number one.
Of course.
How about you, Nick?
Yeah, this is one of those where I feel like, when the survey participants kind of know what you're asking them, you bias the answer a little bit. But generally, my most meaningful accomplishments are other oriented in some way, but not necessarily exclusively. They're usually other oriented. The way I explain purpose, me plus we. There's the we, but I get to use something that I feel good about, or that makes me feel like me, or that I'm interested, like John mentioned, I'm interested in, I'm curious about. So the show is a good example, but anytime you can coach or share science or, guest on somebody else's show, whatever it is, just be able to we'll probably talk about Zach a little bit, and mattering to others via impact, positive impact, right?
Mm-hmm. So whenever you're adding value to others.
Generally, yeah. Doesn't mean it's the only meaning, but it tends to be the most meaningful when what comes up right away, right?
Mm-hmm. And this is a good prompt for the listeners to ask themselves this question. The reason why I asked you that is because a lot of times when people will define and evaluate success, they'll do it on different terms. So some people will say, how do you define success? Well, I define it based on making an impact on people, or I define success based on doing my best or by learning something. But then whenever they evaluate success, they will look at an outcome because it's easy to measure. They'll say, well, like a racer, I define success in the race by following my process goals, which might be starting at a certain speed, riding a certain way, interacting with people a certain way. But at the end of the day, I'm going to look at my outcome, the results or the time, and I'm going to feel dissatisfied because it's not good enough, even if I did all those other things. And that becomes a primary marker of how people are evaluating versus defining. So there's always this mismatch. And that's what I found in my work, is this mismatch between definition and evaluation. And I started trying to figure out, well, what is meaningful whenever, especially with people that have a really difficult time feeling any type of pride. And it's tied in with what you guys were talking about, mattering, social contribution, which leads to feeling like something's bigger than you. And I think a lot of us, we don't mean to, but there can be a self-focus with our goals. We can be thinking very self-referentially without thinking about how the thing that we did impacted others. And it can get confusing because sometimes people will think, well, these compassionate goals, these goals that are just about other people or things that are just about altruism, but you can do a lot with your own personal goals. So an example is I win the bike race and I might think, meh, who cares? I won the bike race. But if I find out that what I'm doing, the way that I'm showing up in the race or just talking about how I'm preparing, that helps somebody be better in their own life and strive for their own goals differently. Well, that feels more fulfilling to me than winning any race. And this kind of builds off Adam Grant's work. He uses the word otherishness and give and take in his book. So how are we? So that this is kind of the foundation of what I think meaningful accomplishment is. It's how are we striving for our own personal goals, our internal experience, but how does that integrate with the external experience and social connectedness in the world?
Yeah. It's good.
Wow. Yeah. So it seems like there's several. Sorry, do you want to say something, Nick?
Well, just a real quick double click on the Adam Grant shout out, because you mentioned sort of the otherish giving. Would you just kind of explain the opposite? Because we're dealing in a big age of burnout. Maybe that's just worth mentioning because it's easy to be too other oriented, basically, right?
Yeah, having some self-interest in your striving while you're helping other people and holding boundaries and making sure they're aligned with your values. Because a lot of times there's a lot of compassion fatigue and burnout in helping professions. So it's important to set those boundaries, and that is very difficult.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah. Let's actually pull on that thread. This is interesting because I was reading an article today actually about teacher burnout in the UK and how the rates at which teachers in the UK are reporting stress-related illness or stress-related, problems such as lack of sleep, because of stress and so on, is on the rise. And it's been, bad for many years, right? So that, and they mentioned in that article that one of the problems is when you really deeply care about the work you're doing, you see it more as a vocation, such as helping young people, improve their lives, educate them, and you're so invested in it that can lead to you kind of giving up everything for it, which can end up being detrimental to your well-being. And then maybe this brings us back full circle to making sacrifices to your well-being to be a high performer. So how do you get the right balance? Because that seems that part of the reason that happens is because you find your accomplishments too meaningful, perhaps. That's one way of putting it, right? You find them there's such a vocation to you. It's like a calling to you that you will go above and beyond to the point where you'll sacrifice sleep, time with your family, you'll accept maybe a low salary to do the job in order to help others. So where does a meaningful accomplishment become problematic because you invest too much meaning in it?
I love this question, and it's very important. David Bluestein has done work on the difference between like decency. He has a 2x2 axis of decency and meaning in work. So people that have lower decency, meaning like they don't have as much stability or as much make as much money as they're worth, and they experience high meaning. And in his study, he talks about zookeepers. This is like the dark side of meaningful work. Teachers fit in that category. Police officers fit in that category, where your work is deeply meaningful, but there's other things that are detracting from living, quote unquote, the good life. So for me, this is like my opinion, is that we need to have different striving mindsets so that we can create a little bit more, I don't want to use the word balance, but so we can create more perspective on the things that we're doing. So you talked about teachers giving up their sleep and their health and their stress because they care too much. But what else is important in life? What are other things in your life that you can care about that can actually add to you so that you don't burn out? What can you do? So like I have this like 6-factor striving model that I'm working on, and I haven't done any research on it. It's more just like observational. But vitality is one of those striving factors, because a lot of times we do give up our vitality for deeply meaningful work. We won't sleep as much. Well, like how many times have I sat here at my computer and I won't get up to go eat the entire day because I'm in flow. I don't want to get out of my chair. Like I'm having a great time doing my meaningful work. But I need to be holding the boundary for vitality. So there needs to be more information and more nuance in what this means to have meaningful accomplishments, and also do it in a way that doesn't burn you out, like what you were talking about.
Hi, everyone. This is just a quick break to thank one of our sponsors, the Shipley School. We're extremely grateful to be supported by our friends at the Shipley School, an institution that has served as a trailblazer of well-being education for decades. Educating to Flourish is an approach to educational practice that promotes a focus on actualizing human potential. While this means continuing to prioritize the development of traditionally academic competencies, it also recognizes that these competencies are a small part of what leads human beings to live good, impactful lives. Using data-driven methods backed by various scientific fields such as neuroscience, educational psychology, behavioral economics, positive psychology, and more, the goal of Shipley's approach is to cultivate flourishing, the synergistic combination of well-being and optimal performance. Shipley aims to do so for all constituencies that make up the entire Shipley community. For more information about the Shipley School and Education for Flourishing, visit shipleyschool.org or contact Dr. Sharon Russell, Director of Student Support and Wellbeing. Thank you.
Hi friends, Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. the ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
People often ask, because there's all these different domains that constitute human flourishing on certain models, such as a model that you're very familiar with in positive psychology, the PERMA theory of well-being, at least 5 areas of well-being that represent PERMA, and the human flourishing program at Harvard has a different model with, again, 5 domains. And when people ask me, how do you kind of balance all these areas to flourish, an answer I often give is, look, you don't have to have exactly the right balance across all of these, this perfect level of positive emotions and flow and accomplishment and meaning and relationships, but rather, you can live a life which really focuses on your relationships more than work, or the other way around. But if you're focusing on one of them so much that it's detrimental to one or more of the others, for example, working such long hours that your relationships deteriorate and your health deteriorates, or spending so much time on your relationships that your work deteriorates, and so on, then that is a problem, right? So you can have different balances, but on the whole, it shouldn't be the case that focusing on any one or more of them is significantly detrimental to the other. Does that connect with something like your view here, if we can kind of figure out where the right balance lies?
I think the balance lies differently for every person, and it's different every day. So I think it's just the intention that we set with it. Like, for example, there might be weeks where I am not as present or available to my family, but then I make sure that I make up for that on the back side of things. If I need to be over-focused on work for a short period of time, I make sure that I over-focus on my family for another period of time, so that I am not being pulled along by these reactions to things that are happening. That's something that I do with my training now. I do so many different things in my life, and people always ask me, how do you do so many things well? And I don't try to do them all at the same time. I try, just like you periodize your training as an athlete, there's periods of intensity, periods of endurance, periods of rest. I try to do that with how I strive for my goals. And on the outside, that might look really imbalanced. But for me, that's how I maintain all of the pieces, that it's not about getting them all perfectly and going hard everywhere all the time. It's about choosing where you're going to be going hard.
You just mentioned pieces. The metaphor I use is Tetris, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, and it's going to be different all the time, but it's whatever gets the job done. You just have to know what the pieces are, right? Especially when you're talking scheduling and time boxing. The way you slot them around or moving them around, you can't do any of that if you're not really conscious of what the pieces are to begin with, your recipe, the ingredients that matter most, and synergizing those, right?
And I also think it's important to talk about the emotions here, because I think there's way too much emphasis on positive emotions.
Way too much.
Yeah. And even when you're doing all these things, you're not going to feel good all the time. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that something is wrong. You might feel good and bad at the same time. Whenever I'm going out to train for 3 hours because I have a race coming up and I'd rather spend time with my daughter or my son, I feel guilty, or I feel icky about the whole thing. But then I also feel good about the fact that I am, working towards something that's important to me. So it's not just about trying to find this perfect balance so you feel good. It's just about being aware how you feel and what are you doing with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. So can we just summarize in your research the key components involved in a meaningful accomplishment? Then we've got mastery, novelty, social contribution, a sense of purpose. Am I correct with those? Are there others as well?
So I did this research for my my master's capstone. I did a qualitative study, but then I've been building off of that. So do you want me to talk about the one that's actually been researched, or do you want me to talk about the one that I'm kind of it's more in the idea stage?
Nick, well, I would say idea stage. What do you think?
Whatever lights you up at the moment.
Yeah, that's a much better way of answering this. I mean, what I'm looking for here is listeners that are listening to this thinking, am I engaged in work that could bring me meaningful accomplishments? And if not, how can I find more of that? What do I need to focus on? That's why I'm looking for these components here, right?
I mean, I'll start with the groundwork of the model. So based on the research that I did talking to people about what makes their accomplishments, it broke down into two different types of goals. One of them I called personal fulfilling goals. And those ones were more about achievement goals and mastery goals. And the things that made those feel meaningful was novelty, being process oriented, and being self-concordant, which kind of I think about like authenticity with that.
Coherence,
and that helps people add value, like in terms of the mattering framework. You mentioned Zach Mercurio, his book's awesome. Adding value to the self, that's what those are doing. They're building self-efficacy and self-determination. They might be increasing I was using Carol Riff's model, like psychological well-being. That's one type, and that doesn't really involve anybody else. That's more just like the thing that you're doing. The other type, I was calling it meaningful otherish goals, building off that otherish term that I used earlier from Adam Grant. And this is more about social contribution. It's about adding value and feeling valued. It's more about the social domain of goals, but it also incorporates your internal experience of what that means to you and like what types of emotions. Like I think it's not about positive emotions. I think it's more about like self-transcendent emotions, because it's not just about you anymore. And the thing that's really important about both of these is making sure that you're taking the time to celebrate the goal that you did or the thing that you're working towards. Because how many times do we just on to the next, or not even on to the next, we'll pause and say, well, that wasn't good enough for XYZ reason. And the first thing that we do is just devalue the thing that we just accomplished. So that was kind of the initial model. But then I thought of some of the limitations, and I thought there has to be more to it than just this. So I'll tell you how I've built upon that, and then I'll stop talking so you can ask me about it. So purpose. Whenever people think about social contribution and those meaningful otherish goals, they realize that, well, maybe I am adding value and feeling valued in the world. Maybe I do matter. And because of that, if I'm contributing to something bigger than me, maybe there's purpose in my life. And the first one that I talked about is more about mastery. But what else is there? There's perspective. There's connection. And connection isn't just about like the R in PERMA. It's not just about relationships, but it's about like, how do we communicate with others? And how does that fit into the mattering framework? And then there's also uniqueness and vitality. So if someone were to say, what are like the 6 driving mindsets that I need to kind of look at as a dashboard as I'm striving towards my goal, I call them like impact, perspective, mastery, connection, uniqueness, and vitality.
Nice. Thank you.
Can I tease something out here? And I'm interested that you went to purpose, because when you were talking about the first 2 categories of goals, my head went to what seemed like it would probably be a Venn diagram where they weren't so siloed. And it went there around, because you mentioned SDT. So my head went to relatedness. And then you mentioned Carol's stuff. So I went to things like environmental mastery and the relationship piece, which was a part of my dissertation as well, which is a great model. And I think speaks to psychological richness to a certain degree as well. But was that, maybe I'm getting too nerdy, was that part of your impetus to go further? Because they didn't, not to assume too much, but they didn't feel kind of segmented enough?
Yeah, what I did actually, I have this like giant whiteboard behind me that I'm very protective of with my 3 and 5-year-old. Do not touch the whiteboard. I have a Venn diagram with like psychological well-being, but also social well-being, like Corey Keyes' work.
Yeah.
And then what is the middle of that? And I think the middle of that is this experience of mattering. And I think this is my claim that I'm going to make, and it might be wrong. But I think that like mattering is like a moderator of meaningful accomplishment. Without mattering, you can't have meaningful accomplishment. And the mattering framework is such a huge framework that it's really like, that's a broad strokes thing to say that. But based on all the other little pieces, I think that in order for us to have meaningful accomplishment, mattering has to be a huge part of that.
Well, let's dig into that then, because that's really interesting and important. So mattering, does that mean that you feel your work matters, or you feel that you matter through your work or at work, for example, in the workplace, or both?
Both. Like mattering, if you look at Isaac Pilatinsky's model, he has this wheel of mattering. And it's the self, it's others, it's in your community, and it's at work. And you can't just matter in one domain. You have to experience it in all the domains. So I've broken it down into some of like the workshops I do is, what is adding value and feeling valued in the self domain? What is adding value and feeling valued look like in the other domain? And then whenever you're striving for your accomplishments, a lot of us are striving to matter through our accomplishments. And there's these myths that I only feel like I matter if I'm perfect, or I only feel like I matter if I'm tough, or whatever it is that comes up in people's minds. So through the myths that you're telling yourself around, I only matter if I do X, Y, Z, that's how you can determine what domains that you're struggling in when it comes to either adding value or feeling valued in the self or the other domain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned Adam's name once or twice. Have you listened to Work Life? Straight through shout out to Work Life, another podcast, but by Adam Grant. There's an episode on bouncing back from rejection about Sarah, and I'm going to forget her last name. Do you know the episode I'm talking about by chance?
No. I need to listen to this because I get rejected all the time.
It's less about that, and it's more about what I hear you describing in some way, shape, or form is like goodness of fit. But I've heard it talked about in terms of values, right? Like, do my values fit with this place, which is going to have a huge impact on like depersonalization and burnout and those sorts of things. I've heard it talked about in terms of like skills and strengths and those sorts of things. And that's kind of how it was talked about in that episode. She was like a high powered sort of exec. I think she ends up getting laid off. Goes to the next job and ends up at like a gaming business, like video games, right? And she's a runner. She's a health nut, all those sorts of things. And I'm saying she. So she is the minority in a gaming company, right? So what happens? Like this highly successful person like flames out. She has no community. There's no one to go running with at lunch. Like her strengths aren't really valued. Her perspective isn't terribly valued either. So fast forward, like after a series of kind of, I think, back and forths and failures, she's now like it was at that point, one of the top execs at Nike, specifically for Nike's women's division, right? So all of a sudden her strengths are seen and honored. Her perspective is seen and honored in a different way. And her story made me think about your model where she's at that point mattering more to herself again, because undoubtedly she was losing confidence along the way as well. She's mattering to work, but she's also mattering to the community within that work and a community she's a part of, unlike the gaming community, right? Does this feel like the example that, or that kind of anchors these 4 parts that you're bringing up for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some nuance here because whenever people are striving for their goals, they're working so hard to add value. And they are adding a lot of value. But this reciprocal relationship of adding value and feeling valued is where it gets really complex because there's a great quote someone gave me in my study. They're talking about how I gave so much, people respected me, people valued the work that I did, but I didn't feel like I belonged. Nobody asked me how I was doing. I didn't feel like I was actually included in anything. So I think like part of accomplishment being meaningful is feeling like you're included and that you belong. And feeling valued is like a lot of times in the mattering, like whenever you hear about mattering, you hear a lot about like positive feedback and like investing in other people. But I think, and then to increase feeling valued, you need to continue adding value. But I think the belonging piece is crucial and is often a bit overlooked.
By the way, Sarah Robbo Hagen.
There you go.
That's the person.
Going back to the goal types that you set up, right? So, and some of it sounds like what we're talking about is framing, right? So what you sort of, how you think about a goal, what matters to you, the mindset going into the goal, those sorts of things. And so to me, it brings up, or it reminds me, how we think about something matters, right? How we look at it, whether or not we savor it. You mentioned it earlier, whether or not we savor our accomplishments, right? The way we were just talking about belonging and mattering felt like it was on the other people. And maybe we didn't mean it that way, but I think that's sometimes the assumption. We got into this with Zach a little bit, I think, when we were talking about it as well, is like, where do you tease out kind of this responsibility or tension between other people have to help us feel included and like we belong and like we matter in these contexts versus they're doing it and going back to my perfectionist tendencies or my lack of self-concept or whatever it might be is actually the blocker here, right? Kind of a loaded question, but thought we might tease that out a little bit.
I mean, I actually included this as a limitation is that even if you're number one, you have to rely on people to give you recognition, which most people don't know how to do. And Zach tells you specifically how to create a culture of mattering through leadership, which is amazing. However, what if nobody ever tells you like that you're seen, heard, valued, and needed, to use his words? Like, what if no one ever tells you that? And furthermore, if somebody tells you that, what if you reject recognition because you're like, we can't even accept a compliment in our society. Like someone's like, hey, I like your shirt. And instead of saying, oh, thank you, you say, well, I have had this forever. And like, we just reject recognition all the time. So what is it that we need in order to like let that recognition sink in? And I don't have a great answer for that, to be honest. But I think it's an important thing to be thinking about, because if someone gives you recognition and you're rejecting it, first notice, I'm rejecting this recognition. And also, like, what type of recognition do I need? Like, there's a specific way, to like name somebody, name the behavior, name the strengths, make it timely, make it specific. But like, what if the person won't internalize that? So like, that is a challenge with this entire model. But whenever you're looking at the self, that's also important, like the adding value and feeling value to the self, because you can't. Part of that is the self is the problem, because if you don't feel value to yourself, you lack self-acceptance and you lack self-compassion. Those are the two components. So if you lack self-acceptance and self-compassion, how are you ever going to receive recognition in a way that it actually hits you?
Yeah. Well, so that's particularly problematic, it seems, for people who are freelancers or solopreneurs who aren't like working in an organization where they maybe have a team of people that you're like, yeah, good job, well done on that, or speaking to audiences or teaching classes, right? So where you've just got an audience. If you're working alone at a laptop most of the time, finding those moments, you're going to be much more reliant on yourself to do that, I can imagine.
And you have to be really thinking about that, because whenever you are doing, we'll use the podcast, for example, how easy is it to get caught up on how many people are listening to your show? Or if somebody's posting something on social media, how many people have liked your post, or like on LinkedIn or whatever. Yeah. And it becomes about that instead of why you're doing it in the first place. And if you found out that you help one person, just one person, that focusing on that would help you with the dissatisfaction of the numbers never being good enough. It's not enough to replace that feeling of dissatisfaction and coming back to the emotions, but it's just about having a balanced perspective of that, of, yes, I'm doing this because I want to help people. And I know for a fact I've helped at least one person, and I might not know what the ripple effect of that is. And I can be dissatisfied with these like numbers that are measurable. And like one of the things that I said in my work was that the reason why social impact feels so good is because you can't measure it. There is nothing to compare it to. There is no absolute number unless you start tracking the number of people that reached out to you.
Nice. Thank you, Sonia. So you coach people through this, right? In your coaching, you help people find meaningful accomplishments without burning out. So based on everything we've discussed so far, what kind of practical advice do you have for listeners on how to find, create, and if they've already found it, maintain meaningful accomplishments, but how to do so without risking burnout?
First is look at how you're striving towards your goals. How much time are you dedicating to other areas of your life? And again, this goes back to that discussion about intentional imbalance and how it doesn't have to just be all one thing or all everything at the same time. What is your intention with this? And are you regularly checking in? Is this aligned with my values? And is this aligned with how I want to show up as a person? And how do I feel as I'm pushing towards these goals? The second is making sure that you're pausing to savor and celebrate the wins. And by wins, I don't mean how well the thing is, how well I did at the thing. I also mean, how is this thing beyond me? How is this impacting the world beyond me? And also, like, how am I growing from this? What am I learning from this? Because it can just be so easy to reduce it to one thing.
That's a good segue into my question. Is we're talking about the self. You just said the self, right? And it makes me think of my business partner, Dr. Adam Wright. He directs mental performance for the Nationals, right? And he tells this story. I've heard him say this 1,000 times. He started out in exercise physiology, right? He would design these perfect training plans, and then nobody would do them. So he went and got a PhD in psychology. And he would help people work on their mental game and confidence and all those sorts of things. And inevitably, he'd run into people who had no sense of self or self-concept. So he went back and got a master's in mental health counseling. What do you do when you run into, let's say, a coaching scenario or a situation in which you feel like you've hit the let's call it reasonable limitations of positive psychological practices, and you think it's something deeper seated. Or better yet, maybe not what you do, what should somebody do if they're struggling to, kind of goal reframe it or gratitude it or those sort of things away, and it's maybe something deeper.
I mean, that's a hard question to answer without an example. Sometimes people actually need to get like real help whenever you're struggling with your sense of self or loss of self. To be less like clinical, I think self-complexity is a really underlooked tool. And I wrote about this a lot for athletes because like athlete identity is a construct where it can be measured, and people have their identity foreclosure at young ages whenever they're pursuing sport. So what can you do to add more to your identity so that you remember who you are beyond just these goals that you're doing? And I think that's where other people come in. I'll give you a personal example. Like most of my friends are not cyclists. Like most of my friends that we don't even talk about cycling because it's just a different part of my life to add more depth. Or another example is, the humanities and human flourishing. Like that's a large area of research. Like how can you use the humanities to remind yourself who you are and experience things that are beyond just like this narrow scope that you've created for what is important in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, and that's a central area of research at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, bringing together the humanities with the sciences to try and address these questions. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sonia. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we have a signature question we ask all of our guests, and we'd love to ask you this question too. It's called the Flourishing Question. What is one lesson on flourishing you'd love our listeners to walk away with, and a practical step putting it into action?
Do something hard that interests you. And as you go through that, like try to learn about yourself through the process, because I think that when you're doing something really hard, that's whenever you can learn the most about yourself. And a practical step is, what is the first step I need to take in order to move in that direction? And a lot of times we're waiting for us to finally feel ready or for somebody else to tell us that we're ready. Just start and you'll figure it out as you go.
Great.
Love that.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yep. Practical, concise.
Put it into action right away, making small steps towards that big goal. Thank you so much, Sonia. So is there anything you'd like to also mention to listeners about work you're doing right now? So you've got your Grow the Good podcast. People can find you all over the internet. What's your website? What are the main things you're working on right now?
Yeah, I mean, just SonyaLooney.com is a great catch-all for all the things. And I love workshops and keynote speaking about many different topics. And I love writing. So those are kind of the main things that I'm working on, and doing a bit of teaching as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Wonderful. Yeah. Sonia, it's been a real pleasure. We really appreciate the time.
Thanks so much. And yeah, I really appreciated the great questions.
Thank you so much, Sonia. You've been listening or watching Resilience, Performance, and Growing the Good with Sonya Looney.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog, and every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.